Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. That evening started like any other in my quiet neighborhood, yet it ended in a way I will never forget. I was sitting in my living room, the windows cracked open to let in the cool autumn air, and the golden light of sunset was spilling across the floor. I remember holding a cup of tea, savoring its warmth in my hands. Life at my age, somewhere between youth's rush and old age's calm, had taught me to cherish the small, ordinary moments. Still, I had no idea that night would be far from ordinary. My neighbor's boy, Daniel, was about 17 at the time. He wasn't a child anymore, but not quite a man either, caught somewhere in that fragile in-between stage. Over the years, I had watched him grow up from a lively little boy riding his bike up and down the street into a quiet teenager who often walked home from school with his head low, lost in his own thoughts. He lived with his father next door, and though I often waved to him, our conversations were usually no more than a polite hello. That evening, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there with his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket. His eyes, usually hidden behind a guarded expression, carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I asked him if everything was all right, and for a moment he hesitated, like he was deciding whether or not he should even be there. Then he asked if we could talk. Something about the way his voice trembled told me this wasn't the casual chatter of a neighbor stopping by. I invited him in, and he stepped quietly into the living room, glancing around as though he didn't want to disturb the stillness of my home. He sat on the edge of the sofa, his shoulders hunched, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. I poured him a cup of tea, hoping it might settle him, but he didn't touch it. For a few long minutes, he didn't say a word. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I didn't push him. At my age, I've learned that sometimes the best thing you can offer another person is patience. Finally, he took a deep breath, his voice low and halting. I need to tell someone something, and I don't know who else to go to. There was an ache in his tone that stirred something in me, an old instinct perhaps of wanting to be a safe place for someone who needed it. I leaned forward slightly and told him he could say whatever was on his mind, and that I would listen without judgment. That was when he began to speak. What he told me wasn't what I expected. He spoke of the loneliness he had been carrying, of the pressure of growing up without a mother in his life, and of the unspoken struggles he felt too ashamed to voice to his father. His words tumbled out awkwardly at first, but as he realized I wasn't interrupting or brushing him off, they gained strength. He spoke of school, of friends who didn't really understand him, of the emptiness he sometimes felt when he came home to a quiet house. As I listened, my heart tightened. I remembered my own younger days, the confusion of feeling unseen, the fear of burdening those around me. His pain was different, of course, but the echoes were familiar. I realized then that sometimes what a person needs most isn't advice or solutions, but simply to be heard and understood. He paused at one point, staring at his hands, and I could see the tension in his jaw. He said quietly, "I didn't think anyone would care." And in that moment, I felt something inside me shift. I told him gently that he mattered, that his feelings were not too heavy to share, and that he was not as invisible as he believed. I reminded him that even in the quiet corners of life, there are people willing to see and hear him. The relief on his face was almost overwhelming. His shoulders softened, and his eyes filled with a light I hadn't seen in them before. It wasn't joy exactly. It was something more fragile, like the first crack of dawn breaking through a long night. And as he sat there, I realized this conversation was not just changing him. It was changing me. For so long, I had drifted through my days with a certain detachment, my routine steady but my heart a little closed. Yet here was this boy, opening himself in raw honesty, reminding me of the power of presence, of what it means to truly be with another person. It was a truth I hadn't expected, and it stayed with me long after he left that night. When Daniel finally rose to go, he thanked me in a voice that was steadier than when he'd arrived. I watched him walk back across the lawn, his figure outlined in the soft glow of the street lamp. I closed the door, sat back down, and felt the weight of his words settle into my soul. That evening had begun as nothing more than another quiet night, but it had become something far more profound. And so, as I sat in the stillness, I realized that sometimes the most unexpected truths don't just come from our peers, or those older and wiser, but from the young who dare to be vulnerable. That night, I learned that listening can change not just one life, but two. The following day felt unusually heavy, as if the echoes of the conversation with Daniel still lingered in the air. I went about my morning routine, boiling water for tea, tidying the living room, feeding the small flock of sparrows that gathered on my porch railing, but there was a quiet pull at the back of my mind. His words from the night before played over and over, especially the way he had said, "I didn't think anyone would care." It haunted me, not in a painful way, but in a way that demanded reflection. As the hours passed, I began to see things around me differently. The neighborhood, usually a blur of comings and goings, seemed more alive. I noticed Daniel walking home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his steps lighter than they had been in weeks. There was a small but noticeable change in him, like the weight he carried had shifted, if only slightly. It made me realize how deeply a single conversation could matter, and how often we underestimate the effect we have on others simply by listening. That evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of pink and orange, there was another knock at my door. When I opened it, Daniel was there again, this time with a faint smile tugging at his lips. He seemed less hesitant, though still a little shy. I welcomed him inside without question, and he settled onto the same sofa where he had sat the night before. He told me he hadn't been able to stop thinking about our talk. He said he felt lighter, but also uneasy, like he had opened a door he couldn't quite close. I nodded, understanding that once we voice a truth long buried, it doesn't vanish. It lingers, reshaping us little by little. I encouraged him to speak freely again, and though his words came slower this time, they carried more depth. He spoke of his father, how much he loved him, but also how distant their relationship felt. His father worked long hours, often coming home late, too tired to talk about much of anything. Daniel admitted that sometimes he wished his father would just sit with him, even in silence, so he wouldn't feel so alone. It wasn't anger he carried, but an ache for closeness that had gone unmet. Listening to him, I was reminded of my own son years ago, when he was Daniel's age. There had been times when I was so consumed with responsibilities that I failed to notice the quiet ways he sought connection. That regret still lived in me, and hearing Daniel's longing brought it sharply to the surface. I felt as though life had given me another chance, through this boy, to remember what it meant to show up for someone. As the night deepened, I shared a little of my own story with him. I told him about the times I had felt unseen, about how easy it is for people to miss the quiet cries for help that often hide behind a smile. I didn't want to lecture him. I wanted him to know he wasn't alone, that the emptiness he felt was something others had known and survived. His eyes widened with a kind of relief, as though my words gave shape to something he had always believed but never heard aloud. At one point, he asked me why I had listened to him so intently the night before. His voice carried both curiosity and disbelief, as if being heard so fully was a rare and precious gift. I told him the truth, that sometimes we don't realize how much we need to listen until the opportunity arrives, and that his honesty had been a gift to me as much as my attention had been to him. There was a pause then, long and comfortable, filled with the soft hum of the night outside. It struck me that he wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for connection, for someone to see him not as a boy fumbling toward adulthood, but as a person whose feelings mattered. And in that moment, I understood more clearly than ever that we all carry truths that can change others if only we have the courage to share them. When he finally stood to leave, he looked me in the eye in a way he hadn't before. There was gratitude there, unspoken but unmistakable. I watched him disappear into the night again, and when the door clicked shut, I sat back and thought about how life brings unexpected intersections, moments when two paths cross, and both are altered forever. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. His visits would become more frequent, each one peeling back another layer of his heart, and each one challenging me to face parts of myself I had long ignored. The truth he had begun to share was not only his. It was slowly becoming mine too, shaping the way I saw the world, the way I saw him, and the way I saw myself. The nights grew cooler as autumn deepened, and with each evening came a new rhythm I hadn't anticipated. Daniel's visits had become almost a quiet ritual. He would knock softly, usually after dinner when the neighborhood had settled into its familiar hush, and I would welcome him inside. At first, I thought perhaps his words would run out, that he would have nothing more to say after unburdening himself. But each time there was more honesty, more truth, more of himself being revealed in ways that startled me with their rawness. One particular evening, I remember lighting a single lamp in the living room, its golden glow softening the shadows. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon from the tea I had steeped, and the world outside was muted except for the sound of leaves scraping along the sidewalk. Daniel came in quietly, carrying that familiar mix of nervousness and resolve. He settled into the same spot on the sofa, but this time, instead of staring at his shoes, he looked directly at me. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady yet uncertain, "about what you told me, that my feelings matter." He paused, swallowed, and then added, "I never thought anyone would really believe that. But when you said it, it felt different, real." I felt something stir inside me, a mix of sorrow and tenderness. I told him it wasn't just something I said to comfort him. It was the truth. And truths, no matter how small they may seem, have the power to heal. His shoulders relaxed a little at that, and for the first time, he smiled without hesitation. It was faint, but it was genuine. That night, he spoke about the dreams he carried but never voiced. He confessed that he wanted to pursue art, though his father expected him to follow a more practical path. He was afraid of disappointing him, afraid of being seen as weak for choosing something that might not guarantee stability. As he spoke, his hands moved nervously, sketching invisible patterns on his knee, as if even in conversation his heart couldn't help but draw. I listened, not with answers, but with presence. I told him that life rarely unfolds as neatly as we expect, and that sometimes the bravest thing one can do is to follow the quiet tug of the heart. I admitted my own regrets, that there were passions I had buried because I thought they were impractical, only to look back years later and wonder what might have been. His eyes softened at my words, as though he had found in me not just a listener, but a companion in the fragile dance of hopes and fears. The silence that followed was not empty. It was rich, filled with understanding that stretched between us. He leaned back against the sofa, more at ease than I had ever seen him, and for the first time I realized something profound. This boy was not only sharing his truths with me, he was giving me the courage to confront my own. As I watched him that night, I thought about how age often tricks us into believing wisdom only flows one way, from elder to youth. But in his presence, I felt the reversal. His honesty, his vulnerability, his willingness to let me see his struggles was teaching me more about life than I had learned in years of solitude. He was reminding me that no matter our age, we are all searching for someone to see us, to hear us, to remind us that our lives matter. When the clock struck 9, Daniel stood to leave. He lingered at the door, glancing back with an expression that seemed to carry gratitude and something else, something I couldn't name. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." As he stepped out into the cool night air, I remained by the door a moment longer, watching his figure fade into the shadows of the street. My home, once filled only with the echo of my own thoughts, now carried the weight of his truths, and with them a light I hadn't known I needed. That night, as I sat alone with the lamp still burning low, I realized this journey was no longer about being a neighbor offering comfort. It was about connection, the kind that bridges generations and teaches us that the simplest act of listening can alter the course of two lives. And though I didn't know it then, the greatest truth was still yet to come. The final evening that stands out in my memory arrived unexpectedly quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath. I had spent most of the day lost in thought, replaying each of Daniel's visits in my mind. His words, his fears, his small, hesitant smiles, they had become woven into my daily rhythm in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself waiting for his knock each night, and though I never admitted it aloud, the absence of it left the house feeling strangely empty. That night, when the soft rap came at the door, I felt both relief and a sense of anticipation. I opened it, and there he stood, his face lit faintly by the porch light. He seemed calmer, more centered, as though the weeks of sharing had slowly unburdened him. When he stepped inside, I noticed he carried no hesitation this time. His shoulders weren't hunched, his eyes weren't avoiding mine. He sat down, and after a long silence, he said, "There's one more thing I need to tell you." The way he said it carried weight, as though this final truth had been the hardest to voice. I didn't press him. I simply nodded and folded my hands in my lap, ready to listen. He told me about his greatest fear, not of failure, not even of disappointing his father, but of becoming invisible. He admitted that sometimes he felt like he could vanish from the world and no one would notice. His voice shook, but his gaze never wavered. Hearing those words pierced me more deeply than anything he had said before. I thought of all the people in my own life who had drifted into silence, whose quiet struggles had gone unseen, and I realized how easily we overlook the weight others carry. I leaned closer and told him, firmly but gently, that he was not invisible, that his voice mattered, that his presence had already changed more lives than he realized. Mine most of all. The words seemed to land within him like seeds, and though he didn't respond right away, I could see something soften in his eyes, something almost like hope. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to weep openly. Not the quiet, hidden tears of someone who wants to go unnoticed, but the kind of tears that come when a burden is finally too heavy to keep inside. I didn't rush to comfort him. I simply sat there, steady and present, letting him know with my silence that he was safe. Sometimes the truest form of love we can offer isn't found in answers, but in the willingness to sit in another's pain without turning away. When his tears slowed, he took a deep breath and whispered, "I'm glad I came here. You've shown me something I didn't think I'd ever find, that it's okay to be myself, to speak, to be heard." The weight of his words filled the room, and I felt a tear slip down my own cheek. In all my years, I had searched for meaning in so many places: work, family, the long stretch of quiet days. Yet here, in these evenings with my neighbor's boy, I had found a truth I hadn't expected, that our lives are made most meaningful not by grand accomplishments, but by the moments we give to one another in honesty and compassion. As he stood to leave that night, there was no heaviness in his step, no shadow hanging over him. He turned at the door, offering a smile that was full and genuine, a smile that spoke of healing and new beginnings. I knew he would continue to face struggles, as all of us do, but I also knew he no longer faced them alone. When the door closed and the quiet of the house returned, I sat there with my thoughts, the lamplight flickering softly against the walls. I realized that the truth Daniel had shared hadn't just changed him, it had changed me. He had reminded me of the power of listening, of connection, of seeing and being seen. And in that reminder, I found my own heart opened wider than it had in years. That evening became a turning point in my life, not because it was dramatic or extraordinary, but because it was real. It taught me that we are all capable of being both healers and the healed, that every generation has wisdom to offer, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most profound truths. Even now, when I look back on those nights, I feel a quiet gratitude. For the boy who knocked on my door, for the truths he shared, and for the way his honesty lit a path in my life I didn't know I needed to walk.